in this episode.
The kind of idealism that um, that doesn't include postulating God is not very satisfying, right? Because it seems to me you end up with all this stuff that just has no explanation. So we're to imagine that there are minds, and there's all these inputs to minds. But what explains the inputs? Where do they come from? Right. So if you're a theistic idealist, you can say, well, God's generating all the inputs. So, I mean, I think the kind of good way to think about this is God has a model of the universe and then generates the inputs so that it seems to the minds that they're living in that universe that's the one that God's got in his mind. Now, as a as a theory, that seems much more expensive to me than just thinking, well, actually, there is a universe and minds are just brains of things within the universe. There's a whole lot more moving parts in the theistic idealism story. But I can see how the theistic idealism story can explain what needs explaining, right? Because you have an explanation for where all the inputs to the minds are coming from. On the kind of analytic idealist approach, it seems to me that there's no explanation for the inputs of the mind. So you just have it's kind of like the worst possible theory because there's all these brute facts. Every input to the mind is just another thing that you can't explain. That's just what came into the mind at this point.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the philosopher of religion, Professor Graham Oppy, perhaps one of the foremost academic atheists in the world of philosophy of religion and theology, who also happens to be a fellow Australian. Now, I don't personally care too much for nationhood and patriotism and all of that, but it was quite nice seeing someone of his intellectual caliber and verbal virtuosity that's a part of my home country. In fact, he probably is an half an hour drive away from where I'm staying, which is kind of nice because most of my guests tend to be either in North America or in Europe. In any case, leaving aside the personal sentiments, Professor Oppy, of course, is publicly most known for his work on the philosophy of religion and for putting forward arguments for atheism. But outside of that, of course, he's done work on the philosophy of math, language, aesthetics, and even science. He's written myriad books, all the way from books on atheism, by the basics by Routledge, to perhaps, I'm not sure if he would consider his magnum opus, God and Ontological Arguments, which we discussed quite deeply in this conversation. And on top of that, we did discuss Gödel's incompleteness theorems and its relationship to epistemology, or what it says or does not say about epistemology and even belief in God. We discussed Gödel's formal proofs for God and even St. Anselm's ontological arguments and a lot more. Before we get started, though, if Professor Oppy, I'm sure who will be listening to this, is listening, sincere apologies. At the end of the podcast, when I was gonna click end recording, I just abruptly ended the meeting. It was rather rude, and I'm sure he knew it was a mistake. But I didn't mean to just end our meeting without any debriefing. In any case, before we get started, though, as I tend to do, a bit of a formal introduction to Professor Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy is a professor of philosophy at Monash University, and before that, did his graduate work at Princeton. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities and the foundation editor of the Australasian Philosophical Review. He's also the author of several books, including Atheism, the Basics by Routledge, arguing about God's and ontological arguments, and belief in God. Additionally, he's also published superlative papers on Gödel's ontological proof for the existence of God. Apart from being a renowned philosopher of religion, he's also published on the philosophy of math, language, aesthetics, and science. Having said that, without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Graham Oppy. Professor Oppy, thank you very much for being here. I really do appreciate your time. It's always nice to talk to an actual person and kind of get over that parasocial relationship, especially given I've been following your work for years. And watching your debates online. And on the note, I've always thought you mentioned in Robinson Earhart's podcast that you've always enjoyed debating, even as a teenager. It's something you think you it kind of gives you, I guess, some kind of adrenaline rush in some sense. But on the note of debates, do you think, and forgive me if this is a bit crass, but do you think debates between theists and atheists, uh, other than them being just spectacle, that they have some kind of philosophical or even epistemic value?
So I maybe there's different things you might mean by debate. So I'm a big fan of conversation between people who have kind of very different ways of thinking about things, because you learn stuff by talking to other people. If you don't talk to them and you start making claims about what they think, you're just guessing or projecting or something like that. So I'm all in favor of conversation, and that's what I try to promote. And I don't mind that the conversations involve disagreement. In fact, conversation's more interesting when you're talking to people who have different views about things than if two people who just agree about everything, the conversation may be less interesting. Whether I like debates, I certainly don't like formal debates. I think that they're typically just not very productive, and they often involve lots of misunderstanding and stereotyping and things like that.
Now that's fair. In fact, when I meant spectacle, I think that's more of what meant, especially kind of in the space of philosophy and mainly religion. Some of the big debates with people like Sam Harris and William Lane Craig, they did get a lot of attention. But I wonder, in terms of the philosophical meat, if there really was much to it. Uh,
So there might have been they may have had other aims, and they may have, their aims might have been realised. And I think in Bill's case, he's got a message that he'd like to get out to people, and that's probably more important to him than the actual um, the kind of technical questions about who won the debate, who dropped the most points, and those kinds of things. And I assume the same would be true for Sam Harris as well. I don't know Sam Harris; I've never spoken to him, but I assume that he had certain goals, right? So there were certain people that he wanted to talk to directly, and one way that you can do that is by engaging in one of these formal debates.
in fact, what are your views on the new atheist movement?
So I've written a bit about this in various places, and I guess there's quite a lot to say. One thing is that the new atheists weren't just atheists. They were, at least as they presented in 2004, they were anti-religion. And in particular, they were kind of worried about Islam, because it was in the shadow of 9/11, but they were worried about fundamentalist religion in general. And in fact, they tended to deny that there was any distinction between fundamentalist religion and other kinds of religion. And so the way that it's presented in those early books, religion is just a kind of bad thing. So Hitchens, Harris, and Dawkins all um, say those kinds of things. It's interesting that very recently it seems that Richard Dawkins is actually a kind of fan of Christianity. It's not that he believes it, but he kind of thinks that it's a good thing after all. And so it's not so clear how to put together what he's saying now with early kind of anti-religion things. Okay, so that's one point. Another point is that maybe Sam Harris might be slightly an outlier here, is that they were typically naturalists, right? So they're typically fans of a kind of view that says what we know about the world, the causal doings of the world, we get from the sciences, the human sciences, the natural sciences, and so on. And then the third thing is atheism. Right, that's another component in the view. They said that they didn't believe in gods. Now, that bit might have, it's a bit odd to label their view as atheism when it has those other bits in it as well that are not consequences of atheism. And when you look at, and so that's one thing. The second thing, if you look at the kind of irreligion, the stuff that really, I think, annoyed lots of people who were pro-religion were kind of annoyed that the new atheists were getting so much attention because of the bad things that they had to say about religion. But that stuff's really quite old, right? So really from the time, I don't know, the late 18th century, you find very strident critics of religion. Chamet in the French Revolution says that Christianity is ridiculous, silly, absurd, right? And then you get other people at the time who are deists saying that organized religion is just atrocious, an atrocity from beginning to end, right? So there's nothing, that kind of stuff isn't new, right? And the rhetoric isn't new either, right? It's been around for a very long time. So apart from worrying about the kind of atheist part of the label, you can also worry about the new part of the label as well. Having said that, there's no doubt that they got lots of attention, right? The Four Horsemen managed to sell. There was a set of books that came out around the same time. I haven't mentioned Dennett so far, but the other one, and those books all did really well and brought them lots of attention and got people talking about various kinds of things. And maybe along with all of the heat that was generated, maybe there was some light that was generated too. Maybe.
Indeed, yeah. I've always thought, I mean, I got into the new atheist stuff when I was a teenager. I like I think most internet people, and I always felt now when I reflect on it, it was more of a mood or even like an aesthetic over a detailed philosophical argument. In fact, here's where I really do appreciate your work. I find that so you don't have to go into detail about this because you've spoken about this publicly in many places. But one thing a point you always put out is that even atheism needs arguments. It's sort of not like you can't just say there is no God and then leave it as it is. So just to perhaps to orient the listeners, if you could just outline, Professor, what you mean by the fact that atheism itself does need arguments.
Well, I guess I'm thinking that it's not so much that they need arguments, but whatever you believe, you better have reasons for believing it. If you don't have any reasons for believing something, then it's not clear that you can stand behind sort of expressing it in words, right? So, and it's also where there's a big division of opinion. So there are lots of people defending both sides. So lots of people saying there are gods and lots of people saying there aren't. It's not very interesting then when we get to the exchange, if on one side the people aren't going to say what their reasons are for taking the stance that they do. Right? So, and indeed, it's kind of, I mean, it's deeply ingrained in people with philosophical training that if you're arguing with somebody and it comes to a proposition that you contest, that you look around for reasons why that proposition's worth affirming, why you think it's true, or why you think it's probable, or whatever the attitude is that you've got towards it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, Professor, on the note of debates and arguments, I have to say I'm sorry if this sounds like I'm flattering you, but well, it was ostensibly a debate, but it was really more of a conversation, and later on it became an interview between you and Bernardo Kastrup. I have to say it really showed the quality of kind of, I'd say, intellectual caliber, where when it started off initially, there was a bit of like a dialectic between you both, but eventually it just became you trying to really deeply understand his position. And for me, mostly as an interviewer, I saw the way that you asked questions and really try to build clarity around it. Towards the end of it, I believe Bernardo himself admitted that yeah, he didn't expect it to be. He had it left a good taste in his mouth. It wasn't that antagonistic. in this, even though you completely had an opposing view to his kind of worldview. So I'm curious, Professor Oppy, just on the idea of analytic idealism that Bernardo Kastrup puts forward. What are your views on the matter? But also, after you had this conversation with him, just your follow-up thoughts and intimations on this conversation.
So, so I guess I've always thought, like many Australian philosophers who grew up reading David Armstrong, Jack Smart, and people like that, that idealism is just a very distant position from the one that I hold. And it seems to me that I can see reasons why the kind of position I've got is preferable to idealism. But I'm always kind of curious when I meet people who profess to be idealists, to find out why and what's driving them and so on. So what I think, and I now can't remember whether I made this argument in the course of the talk, but it was certainly something that I'd been thinking about and writing about in the period before I had the conversation. That the kind of idealism that that doesn't include postulating God is not very satisfying, right? Because it seems to me you end up with all this stuff that just has no explanation. So we're to imagine that there are minds, and there's all these inputs to minds. But what explains the inputs? Where do they come from? Right. So if you're a theistic idealist, you can say, well, God's generating all the inputs. So I think the kind of good way to think about this is God has a model of the universe and then generates the inputs so that it seems to the minds that they're living in that universe that's the one that God's got in his mind. Now, as a theory, that seems much more expensive to me than just thinking, well, actually, there is a universe and minds are just brains of things within the universe. There's a whole lot more moving parts in the theistic idealism story. But I can see how the theistic idealism story can explain what needs explaining, right? Because you have an explanation for where all the inputs to the minds are coming from. On the kind of analytic idealist approach, it seems to me that there's no explanation for the inputs of the mind. So you just have, like, it's kind of like the worst possible theory because there's all these brute facts. Every input to the mind is just another thing that you can't explain. That's just what came into the mind at this point. Right, so that's the kind of worry that I had about. It's one of the worries that I have about the kind of idealism that Kastrup was defending. I'm not sure, because I can't remember now, it's a long time ago since we had the discussion, how much we focused on that kind of question, and I can't remember what his response to it is, if he's got one. But it does seem to me that that kind of worry is a significant worry. Right? And I'll make a kind of related point. If you're not inclined to postulate anything other than the minds and their inputs, it's not clear why you should think there are any other minds at all, right? Why not just think that there are the inputs, right? You can't deny those because you're having experiences. But what reason do you have for thinking that there's anything else that's like you, right? And so that's another kind of worry about the position. Once you're not worried about the fact that you've got no explaining the inputs, why go beyond thinking that there's just you?
So to clarify, what you mean by inputs is sort of like what David Hume means by impressions.
Yeah, something like that. So perceptions generally, and you might think of them as being quite various. So there's visual, auditory, tactile, the kind of internal ones of various kinds. Yeah, but those things, if what you're thinking is you're a mind, all of those things are inputs, right? They're coming into the mind. Where are they coming from? And what explains them? And why are they different in the ways that they're different? And so on. If you're not prepared to tell a story about there being a world, right, and you being an organism, and there being electromagnetic radiation, for example, that's scattered off the surfaces of things and entering your eyes. If you're not prepared to go down that route to explain the stuff that's and identifying you're having the inputs with certain stuff happening in your brain, what's the story that you're going to tell about the inputs, right? Are you are you going to say that they're all just somehow or other fictions of the mind, or are you going to suppose that there's something else that explains those inputs?
So
That's the kind of ground level worry, I think,
yeah, that
that
like
I
the
can
starting
see.
point, because like the kind of the a priori causality, like what causes the inputs. Is that what you're trying to get at? As in, like, if
Yeah,
we,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So why is it that right now, um, my what I can see visually is a computer monitor with a couple of boxes on it with little figures in it, and so on. You can imagine describing your visual field at any time in a great deal of detail. But why is it that that's what you're perceiving right now? It seems to me that the kind of common sense naturalist has a good answer to that question that competing positions just don't have, unless you go the kind of theistic idealist route, right? Because then at least you've got a causal explanation again on the table.
That's correct. In fact, I think here's where it differs, because obviously, George Berkeley, the idealist, he for him there was always God, and God is the source of these events. So in some sense, ourselves were in God's mind. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but with
So
idealism, there isn't. Well, Bernardo is more like agnostic on the idea of mind at large. Is there is some like super mind that
yeah,
allows this?
right. So Barclay's position isn't quite the one that I was elaborating, I think, though it might be. And he certainly thinks that our ideas um, are kind of modeled on ideas in the mind of God. Uh, but he doesn't have any kind of, he doesn't go into the kind of idea that there's a model of the universe, right, that God's got, that is what God uses in order to determine what impressions to send to us. Um, But there are certainly more recent people who've defended that view and thought of it as sort of roughly following Barclay, though with kind of details that aren't clearly there in Barclay's account.
Perfect. Well, okay, Professor. So just to get to your view, I believe you would still consider yourself some kind of an, for sure, a naturalist, but also some kind of a physicalist. So perhaps if you could just outline what view does a physicalist take as like the metaphysical kind of framework you work through to understand being, all the way from well, our minds, but also to the physical world studied by physics, for instance.
So it's not clear that I'm a physicalist. I certainly was, right? So through the 90s, I definitely was a kind of card carrying physicalist. So what that meant is that I was committed to the idea that kind of fundamentally the world is physical, and at the fundamental level, um, there's various physical goings on, and they determine what happens at other levels, higher levels. Now, I've become skeptical about that idea that reality is divided into levels, and that there's a kind of fundamental level, the physical level, which determines what happens higher up. So I'm more attracted to a view which thinks that the universe exists at various scales, and there can be influences that go from the kind of higher scales to lower scales, as well as from lower scales to upper scales. So that kind of, if you go that way, then I'll be a naturalist, but I won't be a physicalist. Now, I don't really have a kind of settled view about this. That's kind of what I'm attracted to at the moment. Um, what whether whether in the whether if you come back in 2 years' time, I'll still think that uh, we shouldn't think about reality as having a fundamental physical level that determines all the rest of it or not. I might change my mind again, but that's not where I'm currently sitting.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, also, you saying you're a physicalist, that doesn't in any way say that you're not a naturalist in the sense that you don't believe there's a supernatural cause outside the natural world to explain phenomena and what goes on in the natural world, correct?
Right. So I think that if you're a physicalist, you're just automatically a naturalist, but it doesn't go the other way. You don't have to think, I mean, to pick one kind of extreme kind of physicalism, that all inquiry could be conducted in the language of microphysics. Right? I think that's just obviously false. That's a kind of one way of thinking about reductive physicalism or physicalism. Um, but I've come to sort of have doubts about whether any kind of physicalism is true. I've come to think that it's not just that the kind of vocabularies of the various sciences are independent, but that there's there's no relation of determination that runs from the fundamental level of reality upwards.
Indeed, indeed. In fact, if you could just speculate a bit, would this change in you? Is it because of the findings of quantum mechanics and the different myriad interpretations, like Carlo Rovelli's one, with his like fundamentally everything is events, nothing exists. He has a very spiritualist take to it, and then of course, like even people like Lee Smolin, who I thoroughly enjoy reading. So is it mostly because of that, or is it more for just purely philosophical, metaphysical reasons that you've changed your mind in the past
Yeah.
decade?
So it's not because of quantum mechanics. I don't really know what to think about the debate about the interpretations of quantum mechanics. Sometimes I'm kind of tempted to just take a kind of instrumentalist view, right, about quantum mechanics. We have this uh, way of predicting and explaining what happens at very low levels, but why that way works is very hard to explain, right? And it's not clear that anybody's got a good account of that. Yeah. Um, so, so that's just a way of saying, really, I'm kind of agnostic about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. I don't have a horse in that field. I don't think that I'm ever likely to be in a position where I'll have an informed opinion about that. It's just one of many things that I'm going to remain ignorant about. Um, Okay, so it's more philosophical, the reasons, and I'm not sure that I've got arguments. It's more just a kind of hunch at this stage, uh, that there's something very well. It's a very bold conjecture, I think, that there's a fundamental level that determines, all the higher levels. I'm kind of happy with the idea that there are that we can describe the universe at different I don't think level's quite the right word, but at different magnitudes, right? At different scales. Oh, scale is a good word. We can describe the universe at different scales. And then there's this question about how those descriptions fit together. And the kind of physicalist view is that somehow the descriptions at the higher levels are fixed by the description at the lowest level. Maybe not because they're entailed, but at least because you have a kind of relationship of supervenience. And I'm not sure that that's the right way to think about the relation between the kind of descriptions at different scales. So I'll just leave it at that.
Nah, that's fair. In fact, Professor Oppy, like because I told you I'm doing this book study on Gödel, there's an interesting idea the idea of strange loops, and where like you can't really absolutely differentiate or delineate between the higher and the lower. He calls it a tangled hierarchy where the higher leads to the lower and the lower leads to the higher, which is where you see it beautifully in Escher's lithographs and his paintings. So it is, yeah. I'd say my view also has changed in the past around 5 years. It's mostly more of like a hunch over a detailed analysis I can do. Just seeing all these myriad paradoxes that appear in different disciplines. All right. Speaking of paradox, I'd love to ask you about Gödel. So I listened to a few of your talks, read your paper on, well, you mentioned it in your book too, but also more of your one of your kind of follow-up papers you did on his ontological arguments, ontological proof for God. And then you had an excellent talk where it's called the alleged epistemological consequences of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But anyway, before we get to that, in general, and I know this is a bit of an ask, so apologies in advance. If you could just on a high level outline what is Gödel's ontological argument for God, and then of course if you could critique it and just intimate on what your views on it are.
Okay, so Gödel devised this argument on the basis of a reading of Leibniz. So Leibniz had looked at Descartes' proof and said, well, Descartes' proof assumes that it's possible that God exists, but we really need to prove that. And Leibniz had sketched out a kind of proof that most people find unsatisfactory. And Gödel said, we can do better than that. I can give you a valid argument that gets you to the conclusion that it's possible that God exists. And in the contemporary philosophy of religion, you can take that and plug it into a modal ontological argument. Once you've got it's possible that God exists, you can conclude that God exists, right? So the important part of what Gödel does is the proof that it's possible that God exists. So how does his proof go? Well, he starts with the notion of a perfection, and he doesn't explain what perfections are, but that we can ultimately we'll be thinking of them as God's properties, right? But to start with, let's just assume that we have some understanding of what a perfection is. Maybe a property that is better to have than not to have, no matter what you are. Okay, so here's two claims that Gödel wants to make about perfections. First, if a property A is a perfection, then the negation of that property, not A, is not a perfection. Second, if you've got some perfections and they entail some other property, that property is also a perfection, right? So if it's kind of necessarily the case that anything that has these perfections has this property, then this property too is a perfection. One consequence of that will be that, for example, trivial logical properties are perfections, right? Being such that either it's raining or it isn't, right, will be a perfection because that's a necessary property of everything. I mean, you can pick other things like being self-identical. That will be a perfection. Okay, now from these two claims that if A is a perfection, then not A isn't, and I'll describe the other one as perfections closed under entailment, it follows that it's possible that there's something that has, for any perfection that has that perfection, and for any group of perfections that it has that group of perfections, right? So that perfections are possibly instantiated and possibly co-instantiated. Why is that? Well, pick a property that you want to say is a perfection, right? And suppose that it's not possible that it's instantiated, right? Because what we're arguing is that it's possible. So we're going to do this by supposing the opposite and showing it leads to absurdity. So let's call the property C. Suppose that C isn't possibly instantiated. Well, what follows from that is that C entails every property, because if a property is not possibly instantiated, then it entails every property. So in particular, C entails not C, which means that it can't be a perfection, because remember, perfections were such that if C is a perfection, then not C isn't. Right. So just putting together those two things, that if a property is a perfection, its negation isn't, and perfections are closed under entailment, you get out that perfections are possibly instantiated. Now, how is Gödel's proof going to go? Well, he's going to make some assumptions now about what things are actually perfections. So necessary existence, necessary omnipotence, necessary omniscience, and so on. Right. And assuming that those are perfections, it follows that it's possible that there's something that necessarily exists, essentially omnipotent, and so on. The difficulty is that if you think about the positions that you can take with respect to a necessarily existent God, there are only two positions. Either it's necessary that there's such a thing, or it's impossible. Right. So when you assume that these things are perfections, you're already assuming that it's possible that they're instantiated, right? Given the way that the two conditions were set up, anything that's not possibly instantiated can't be a perfection, right? So those people who are opponents of necessary being theism, and that includes mostly atheists, but there are some theists who aren't necessary being theists, they're committed to saying, no, those properties are not possibly instantiated. And so they're not going to turn out to be perfections if what's required to be a perfection is it satisfies those two conditions. Right. So essentially that's what's wrong with Gödel's ontological proof. Right. It doesn't give anybody except people who already accept the conclusion a reason to move from the premises to the conclusion. Anybody who doesn't already accept the conclusion is going to say, well, it can't be that these properties like necessary existence and omnipotence satisfy those conditions, that pair of conditions.
Okay, so is it the modality bit, the part that we say it's necessarily perfect for a godlike being to have these properties? Is that where the issue arises, because we start from that axiom?
It comes from just supposing, so the word perfection wasn't really doing any work here, right? Suppose that we just say there's a class of properties, the A properties, that satisfy the following two conditions. If B is an A property, then not B isn't, and the B properties are closed under entailment. It will follow that if you've got some B properties, they're possibly jointly instantiated, right? It must be possible for there to be. It must be that possibly there's something that has all of those properties. Right now, so for example, suppose I take the B properties to be your properties, right? Well, you don't satisfy, there's no property that you've got such that you've also got its negation. And if a bunch of things are your properties and they entail some other property, then of course you've got it. So we can run this style of argument with respect to you because you exist. But if I try to I can't turn this into an a priori proof of your existence, right? Because I have to know ahead of time that the properties are jointly instantiated in you in order to make it the case that you can instantiate the argument, right? If there were people who I don't know, this is kind of weird. If there were people who disputed your existence and we picked out some of your properties, they would say, well, I don't think there's anything that's good. The proof wouldn't persuade them of your existence then.
I see. So the idea is it's more like in retrospect, you put the properties after which is why.
Yeah. Well, in order to get to the conclusion that it was God that exists, you have to feed some godlike properties into
Property,
this
yeah,
machinery. You have to say this thing necessarily exists. You've got to force that one in. Like if you think there's
yeah, the
nothing that exists
axioms, yeah.
necessarily, then you're not going to think that you're going to think it's impossible that there are
Mm,
such things, right? But it's not just that. In order for it to get to God, we're going to need to have some other things like arguably omnipotence, omniscience, and so on. But if you're like me, you think it's impossible that there's anything that's omnipotent or omniscient or so on.
yeah,
And so those properties can't satisfy the two conditions that you're using in order to get to the conclusion that it's possible that there's something that has these properties.
yeah,
That's why I think it's not a successful argument. Of course, if you're a theist, you can think that it's a sound argument. You can think the conclusion follows from the premises, and you can think that all the premises are true. But it doesn't give somebody who doesn't accept that conception of God any reason at all to change their mind, right?
yeah. And I mean, depending on the premises, we could even. I mean, in fact, you've said on the paper, the problem, as with virtually all ontological arguments known to me, lies in the fact that there are parallel arguments which can be constructed, which seem no less acceptable to atheists and agnostics, but but whose acceptance leads to absurd results.
So I think that's right, though in this particular case, it's kind of hard to come up with a compelling example because if you accept what I just said, you don't need a kind of parody. You can just see that there's a good reason why this argument's not going to persuade anybody who doesn't already accept the conclusion.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go back to Anselm's argument um, and Gornillo's response, where Gornillo says to Anselm, look, if you think that you can prove the existence of God that way, we can prove the existence of a perfect island by an island in which no greater island can be conceived. We can prove that by exactly the same argument. And there, the utility of that response is that it's not so clear exactly what you want to say is the misstep in Anselm's argument. But you don't have to if you can show that you can just take the argument and adapt it to prove absurd things. That should undermine your confidence that the argument that you started with was a good one. Right. So that's the
Yeah.
kind of Gödel strategy. And back in the 90s, when I wasn't so sure I knew what was wrong with Gödel's argument, I played around with trying to do something similar to kind of get absurd conclusions out of the Gödel argument by paralleling it, just changing the inputs a little bit. I still think you can probably do that, but I just don't think that it's an interesting project anymore because unlike Anselm's argument, Gödel's argument was devised by a logician and it's a perfectly clear and transparent argument, right?
Self-enclosed within a
And
book.
and, and so you should be able to pinpoint if you think that if the argument doesn't work, you should be able to pinpoint what's wrong with it. Whereas Anselm's argument is formulated I was going to say in everyday language, but it's everyday language quite
Yeah,
way back in the past, and it's much harder to try to to say, look, here's the point where that argument goes wrong. It's much harder to do that, but then you can still, if you think that Gornillo was onto something, you can still think the argument's no good, even if you can't pinpoint exactly where it goes wrong, because you can show that it kind of allows you to generate these absurd results.
indeed, indeed. Y- Yeah, I mean, that's one thing for me, as a neophyte, when I started looking into Gödel's uh, formal proof for God, because it's a formal proof, it's airtight, and there's some kind of genius to it. And I lacked the ability to. I was like, this makes a lot of sense within the system, but it is brilliant. So Professor Oppy, on the note of Gödel, just a bit of a segue here. Well, it's really interesting. You gave this talk regarding the incompleteness theorems. So just for the listeners, so the two theorems would say that the first one is the idea of self-reference, that any formal system, it can tell truths about itself that sit outside of the system. Kind of and then the second one is a system can't prove its own consistency. Now, of course, this is on the face of it are the limits of formal systems. The kind of what Gödel intimates at. But then I'm wondering, firstly, uh, how do you think the relationship between Gödel's theorems and then our epistemology is? Like, what are your intimations on that? And would you say that a limit on axiomatization isn't really a limit on our knowledge, as in there are things we can know outside of axiomatic systems?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot to say here. So
Yeah, please take your time. I have a bit of a
let's go back a bit. The way that I'm thinking about um, the the Gödel result that I'm interested in talking about is that it says that there's no um, complete recursive axiomatization of arithmetic. Now, to avoid explaining what recursive means, let's fudge a little bit and pretend that it's just saying there's no finite axiomatization of arithmetic, and we're fudging over some stuff that really isn't going to matter for the purposes of the conversation, I think. Okay. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't seem to suggest any limitations on what we can know, right? Unless you're thinking that the way that we know things is by deriving them from axioms. But as Russell pointed out a long time ago now, like in 1905 or something, it's not plausible even that mathematicians proceed that way. And it's rather that when you're making an axiomatization, it's a constraint on the axiomatization that it gives us back the stuff that you already know.
kind of retroactively.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So famously in Principia, Russell and Whitehead take about 300 pages to get to the proof that 1 and 1 are 2. But it's a good thing that they get there eventually, right? Because if it had got to that point and they'd found that their axioms entailed that 1 and 1 are 3, that would have been really bad. And if it had turned out that you couldn't derive 1 and 1 are 2 from their axioms, that would have been equally bad, right? So the so it's not, I don't think that there's kind of even prima facie plausibility to the idea that the way that we acquire knowledge is by making inferences from axioms, even in mathematics, never mind more broadly. And so it's not clear then why there being constraints, you know, you know, on axiomatization, that we can't make a finite axiomatization of arithmetic. It's not clear that that's got any implications for epistemology of mathematics or for epistemology of anything else. So that's the kind of simplest point that I make in the talk.
Indeed, indeed. But also, as a philosopher of religion, apropos epistemology, you also do mention that, well, if you could bring in the arguments that some people have tried to claim that, the Gödel's incompleteness theorem in some way points at God or some kind of super entity. But then, of course, you said this is not the case. So if you could just comment a bit on that.
So it's not. So what am I going to say now? I mean, it's not clear why you would think that it pointed at God, right? There's nothing in the argument that says that establishes that there are propositions that we can't know, right? So that there are particular propositions that we can't know. What is true is that if you've got a particular formulation of arithmetic, so think about piano arithmetic, there will be true claims in arithmetic that you can't derive from those axioms, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't. I mean, if we find a claim that you can't derive from the piano axioms, it doesn't mean that we can't prove them in some other way, that we don't have some access to them in some other way. And in fact, it seems that that's actually the case, right? So there's this work that was done by Paris and Harrington in the 70s, which was actually based on very similar to work that was done in the 30s, not long after Gödel produced his original proof, where you can point to mathematical results that we know are true, but you can't prove them from the Peano axioms, right? The fact that you couldn't get to them from that, your axiomatization of arithmetic was incomplete. There were things that you couldn't prove from that axiomatization, did nothing to show that you couldn't access those truths in some other way, right? And it would only be if, we were born and the Peano axioms were hardwired into our brains and we couldn't add anything more to them, that particular claim would become one that was inaccessible to us, right? But it's not like that. So it doesn't follow, at least not yet, and not in any straightforward way, that there are claims that we can't get to. Right? Now, I spend most of my paper arguing that actually most of arithmetic is inaccessible to us, right? For kind of boring, mundane reasons. But I don't think that anybody's going to take that as kind of reinstating a proof of the existence of God. So, I mean, just to give you a flavor of the thing that occupies most of the talk, think about simple arithmetical sums where you add two numbers to make a third, right? And think about your ability to understand a sum like that. If it's two digits and either two digits or two digits plus a one in the furthest column to the left. Those sums, we can look at them and we can just sort of look at them and kind of intuit straight away whether they're, a sum that's written like that is true or false. 23 and 46 and 91, not true, right? I mean, you can do, and maybe you can do this for 3 and 4 digits. You won't get much further. However, we have other techniques. Pen and paper, if I write you out 50 digits, and either 50 or 51, you can check it. It's going to take you a while. It's kind of boring, right? Okay, now let's ramp it up a bit. A Google's quite a large number, 10 to 100. Let's imagine 10 to the Google, right? So let's go big. Now think about a sum where, and I'm not thinking about one that's easy, like a 1 followed by Google zeros plus 2 followed by Google zeros equals 3 followed by Google zeros. Okay, fine. One where you can't compress the information in the digits. One of those sums, right? There are lots. There are sums out there, right? There are truths. They follow from the Peano axioms, right? Whether any one of the huge number of those sums that there are is a theorem or not a theorem, depending upon particular choice. We can't grasp any of them. We can't assess any of them. I imagine God making a big steel plate with one of these potential sums on it, with a string of Googleplex digits, another string, a line, another string. And there's a walkway, and he puts you in the middle of it and says, okay, your job is to determine whether this is a theorem or not, right? And you can walk a tiny fraction in either direction before you die, right? Your 70 years or whatever that you're allotted will elapse, and you'll have examined almost none of the sum, right? It's obvious that there are, I mean, to go back to a point maybe I could have made before, if we went up not to a Googleplex digits, but say roughly 10 to the 80 digits, and if we think of needing a bit to represent each digit, there aren't enough elementary particles in the universe to enable you to represent that sum, and that sum's tiny compared to the Googleplex one, right? So, I mean, so we can imagine a scale where we kind of measure, we rank people according to their ability to comprehend sums of a certain size. So we're greater than 2, maybe we're at 45, though that seems questionable. We're certainly not at 10 to the 80. We're certainly not at 10 to the Googleplex. We can imagine creatures, but whatever creature we imagine, there's going to be some finite limit. And beyond that are going to be most of the sums, because that's an infinite thing, right? And you've got some tiny finite section down the bottom. I mean, it sounds big if it's 10 to the Googleplex, but that's still essentially measure zero compared to the whole thing. So basically, we know nothing about arithmetical sums. Doesn't bother us. Does it prove that there's a God? I don't think so, right?
Yeah, this is what I mean, Professor. Like all these, I don't know. Sometimes I find that I believe Richard Dawkins from all people used to call it Jesus planing, or there's a term I can't recall the term, where you kind of like just you kind of bring in God from nowhere, you kind of make that leap in some sense. And in fact, just on the note, I mean, you don't have to comment too much on this because I want to be cognizant of your time. But the conversation you had with William Lane Craig, Bill, regarding does math point to God? And then his whole point, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that this kind of aesthetic impulse that a mathematician would have, it points towards some kind of divine entity. And then you both had a discussion regarding set theory and how people pick different, sets of axioms like Zimmer or Frankel, or be that as it may. But again, I just if you could comment on the idea that's like why is it that theists tend to find these different domains, be it in the physical sciences or mathematics, and then try and suddenly make that leap towards God?
So in this case, um, so Bill's picking up on a paper by physicist Eugene Wigner, who claimed that there was something mysterious about the fact that that mathematics seems so eminently suited to making discoveries about the world, right? Um, now, and Bill's explanation is that, well, God made the world according to have a mathematical structure for divine purposes, maybe to do with the fact that we would be able to discover them or something, that would make the world intelligible to us in certain ways or whatever. Um, so that's the kind of framework for the discussion. Um, I guess there's a bunch of different things to say. And indeed, that conversation was quite convoluted. It got kind of fairly deep into the weeds of Wigner's paper and his motivations and so on. One thing you might think is that it wouldn't matter what the world was like, mathematics would be able to give them a reasonably compact description of it, um, which that would be one way of trying to undercut the idea that there was kind of a good inference to God here. But another way to go would be to claim that the fit between mathematics and the world is kind of a necessary fit, right? There's mathematics couldn't have been different, and in relevant respects, the world couldn't have been different either. And you don't require God to make that the case. It's just because necessities don't need to be made true, right?
That's
If
correct.
something's necessary, it can't be otherwise, right? And so you don't need someone to make it that way. And so that's a kind of different approach that you could take to trying to, if you accept the idea. Because the third thing is you might think that actually it's not that there's this amazing fit between mathematics and the world. Mathematics is just so incredibly capacious that it sometimes turned out that people wrote down equations and made predictions on the basis of them that turned out to be true. But when we tell that history, we forget about the many more times when people wrote down equations, made predictions, and they turned out to be false, right?
Yes.
So that there's a kind of selection effect that's operating here. So that we point to things like Dirac's postulation of the positron on the basis of an equation that he wrote down. And sure, that turned out to be an inspired guess. But for every Dirac, there's a million people who physicists who write down equations that make equally wacky seeming predictions and just turn out to be false. Right. So there's that point as well.
Yeah, but also, Professor, isn't it the case that even within mathematics, so for instance, for 2000 years, we had Euclidean geometry, and now we have non-Euclidean geometry. As in, this is more of a question pertaining to the philosophy of mathematics. If working physicists or mathematicians or whoever, economists, whoever it may be, they kind of pick the mathematical axioms, the mathematics that choose their world in the real physical world, and then they use it as an instrument to to for whatever the purpose they have. It's not the other way around, where in some sense mathematics tells us what the world is, but we use mathematics as an instrument to understand the existing physical world.
Right. So the question, I think that's right. But the question or the thought that Bill's got is that it's incredibly effective at doing that.
How is it? Yeah.
But lots of our models are not quite right. So take Newtonian mechanics, right? There are certain problems like the precession of the perihelion of Becker where it just gives you the wrong answer, right? And it's kind of, I mean, given that mathematics works quite well but not perfectly, you're in a kind of awkward position now if we're going to make these inferences to perfect designer or whatever. Maybe God was, he was kind of, as far as gods go, a bit mediocre as an engineer
Or
because
even being able to.
or whatever. Right. So I mean, it kind of matters that the theories that we have never seem to fit the world perfectly. I mean, it's true that with quantum mechanics, you have this remarkable precision. We have 10 significant figures or something, which is just kind of, you don't get that in science very often, that degree of precision
Indeed.
in predictions. But most of the ways in which mathematical theories work, you don't get anything near that.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, yeah. Uh, all right, Professor. I think now I want to get to the ontological arguments. But although before I get to that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, just a general idea of ontology and metaphysics. So, in the history of philosophy, of course, we had the Kantian Copernican revolution, where he created this world where we have the transcendental horizon, and we can what we can know is there, and then he had the thing in itself, the dust thing, or as he would call it, that which we have no way of knowing. We can't even cognize it in any sense. So, just my first question before we get to your specific work regarding arguments, ontological arguments, would be that uh, after the Kantian revolution, do you think there is a place for metaphysics and ontology?
There are kind of interesting recent developments in philosophy in let's maybe call it ontological category theory, which turned out to be really quite important in computer science and a range of other scientific domains. So I think that it will be very hard to argue against a role for ontology, um, not just in philosophy, but sort of more broadly. So I'm thinking of the work of people like Barry Smith, but there are lots of other people. Metaphysics maybe has has a less good rap than ontology, but it's hard to avoid doing metaphysics or engaging in metaphysical speculation if you're arguing with people about the existence of certain things or kinds of things or categories or so on. So it's kind of inevitable that in discussions between naturalists and theists, there's metaphysical speculation going on. And you can think of the postulation of God as a bit of metaphysical speculation. So I don't think that Kant has any particular significance for metaphysics in that sense, metaphysical speculation in that sense. And I know there are people who think that there's kind of pre-critical metaphysical speculation and post-critical speculation, and somehow or other the pre-critical metaphysics was defective in ways in which the kind of post-critical metaphysics is not. That seems kind of implausible to me. I don't see that that the way that Kant tries to make room for metaphysics is particularly an improvement over the approach that Hume takes towards metaphysics, for example. But that's all stuff for philosophers to argue about.
Okay, okay. Because my understanding was, again, as a neophyte, is that Kant was quite adamant that he was doing epistemology, like in the critique, he all the categories and all of that was within kind of what we can know in that sense. But then he even says, and this probably connects well to your book about belief in God, that uh, when it comes to faith, one has to put away reason and sort of have faith to ultimately believe in God, because for him, there's like argumentative uh, ways to approach the existence of God. It's just insufficient. Or maybe I'm wrong there, but just
So I think that's not quite right. So
okay.
Kant certainly thinks that you can't use pure reason, right, to get to God, but
Yeah,
he thinks that it's sort of a necessary postulate of practical reason, right? So that to postulate what's the Trinity, God, freedom, and whatever. Immortality, God, freedom, and immortality. That I mean, I'm inclined to disagree with him on both sides of that dilemma. I don't think that there's any kind of practical necessity in religious belief, and I don't think that there's any practical necessity to think that we're immortal, or free,
on the
or that
latter.
or that there's a God. Though on the kind of freedom question, I'm inclined to agree that we do have a kind of freedom, but that's a different issue.
Yeah. No, on the latter, on the idea that immortality, I agree. I mean, eternal life for me sounds like hell. I wouldn't want to live forever. Um,
So most people think, I mean, it depends a bit on the circumstances. If you're 90 and your health is really failed, maybe you don't want to live much longer. But when you're 30, you think, well, 80 years is just not that long. I wish it was a bit more.
that's
Right.
fair. That's fair. Well, also, I think it was Pascal who said that what constitutes the human condition is boredom, the inability to sit in a room by yourself. And I'm coming to see that he was like a proto-existentialist. So I think he has a point that, what people get bored with time, especially when things are good.
Right. So, and we have finite capacities and powers. So, assuming that it's us in the afterlife, eventually we're going to forget stuff. We're going to forget it, almost everything, right,
That's
over
true.
time. And so it's not. So then forgetting's a kind of death, right? If you don't remember your parents at all anymore.
Indeed.
Uh,
What's even the purpose
Right,
without
right, right,
what's
right. That's not great. And so I think that point that you're making, there's definitely something to that. Right. We are not creatures destined for infinity. Right.
infinity? Yeah, I think Heidegger writes well on this, that the idea that to be a Dasein is to understand that we are finite, we have a sense of finitude to us, and then he calls it demise, I think. And here's where I'm very much attracted to the existentialist kind of thinking, because they do capture human subjectivity rather astutely. All right, Professor. To the ontological arguments, what a book! What a book! I'm glad that I found a cheaper copy online, because it was a bit hard to find. The one I found initially was about $200. So thank you for
Yeah.
pointing me to something.
Yeah.
Uh,
The hardbacks are of academic books published by presses like CUP and OUP are ridiculously
Yes,
expensive, and that's not to mention presses like Springer, which jack the price up
even more.
Considerably more.
So, okay, Professor Oppy, firstly, just for the viewer again, please, if you could just outline what are ontological arguments, and then kind of why your claim is that they do nothing in making claims for belief in God.
Okay, so I might say something about the second thing. I mean, try to rephrase that a little bit later. But
Of course, please do.
but for the first bit, so one way of thinking about this is Anselm produced an argument back in 1078, and it's an argument that seems to just reason to the existence of God without making any assumptions, right? Beyond perhaps some assumptions that you can know a priori, right? Maybe, right? So it's just a kind of a train of reasoning that doesn't appeal to any experimental data or observations of the world. It doesn't appeal to causation or time. Doesn't appeal to the complexity of animals. Right? It's a theoretical and arguably a priori argument. That was certainly the way that Kant thought about it. He thought it was a priori. And then there have been other arguments that are clearly similar to Anselm's argument. And that gives you a family of arguments that are the ontological arguments. Now, explaining it that way, they're kind of clearly similar to it, is perhaps useful because it's hard to say exactly what is special about the premises of Anselm's argument or about ontological arguments generally. Maybe what you might want to say is to just follow Kant and say, well, all the premises are knowable a priori. But it's not clear when we actually look at the ontological arguments that that's right. Right. But so although it sounds kind of less satisfactory, I think the right way to think about what the ontological arguments are is that it's a family of arguments that you can see of as being appropriately related to Anselm's argument. Right. And so there are very different kinds of arguments here. So I'll give you a couple of them just quickly. So Anselm's argument goes like this. When you hear the words that than which no greater can be conceived, you understand them. What is understood exists in the understanding, so that than which no greater can be conceived exists in the understanding. But it doesn't exist only in the understanding, because if it did, we could think of something greater, namely something like it that exists in reality as well. But it's just absurd to think that you can think of something greater than that than which no greater can be conceived, so that than which no greater can be conceived exists in reality. But of course, that than which no greater can be conceived has the various properties of the Christian God. So it turns out that the Christian God exists. Right. That's basically the argument of the proslogion. Later, Descartes gives a bunch of, well, it's not clear. There's this kind of syllogism that it's not really Descartes' argument, but it's kind of central to it. God, by definition, God has all the perfections, but existence is a perfection, so God has existence, which means God exists. It's a simpler argument than Anselm's, but it's got some relation to it. We've already talked about Gödel's argument.
Indeed.
And I mentioned modal ontological argument, but I should explain that one very briefly. So the idea is that necessarily if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, right? That's a kind of way of thinking about our conception of God as necessary being. But it's possible that God exists. That seems a very trivial thing to concede. But from these two premises with a bit of modal logic, it follows that God exists. So just from the idea of God, plus the further premise that it's possible that God exists, which is something that you might think you can know, possibility claims in general are pretty cheap. There's no obvious contradiction in the idea that God exists. right? So that's the kind of modal proof of the existence of God. There are some other, I mean, in my book, I distinguished a bunch of other ontological arguments, and there are more that I've discussed in later work that weren't discussed there. But if we were thinking about what are the main arguments here, there's Anselm's argument, there's the Gödel argument, and in sort of sitting behind that, there's the modal ontological argument. Those are the three most discussed ontological arguments now.
Yeah. So, and what's your claim that? Why do you claim that ultimately they can't prove God?
So I think that when you examine the arguments in detail, you find that the arguments are all unsatisfactory for one reason or another. Either they turn out to be invalid. And so, for example, reconstructions of Anselm's argument often have at least one reading on which it turns out to be invalid. So the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. Or they turn out to have premises that are obviously false, and that sometimes happens in ontological arguments. Maybe that happens in Anselm's argument, depending upon exactly how you construe it. Or they're obviously such as not to be capable of persuading someone who didn't already accept the conclusion to accept it, right? So some ontological arguments, it's kind of obvious to anybody that certain kinds of theists are going to think they're sound and everybody else is going to think that they're not sound, right? And
Okay.
so, and because it's kind of obvious that that's the case, they're not going to actually do any useful work for anybody.
Oh, okay. I may have misunderstood something here, Professor. The meaning, my understanding was that you're saying ontological arguments in some sense necessarily can never prove God, or in the sense.
So I certainly said that, but I think that was a mistake, right? I said that in the book on ontological arguments. What I would say is I can't. There isn't a proof that there can't be a successful ontological argument. But if you look at all the arguments that have ever been put forward that are ontological arguments, they fall foul of one of the three conditions that I mentioned, and we have no reason to think that kind of just around the corner someone's going to produce a better ontological argument. But it would be like to show that there couldn't be a successful ontological argument, to prove that, you probably need to be able to prove that there's no God, right? And I think that that's kind of too much. Atheists don't need to prove that there's no God. It just needs to be reasonable for them to think that there isn't one, right?
Correct.
And
Yeah, I mean,
so the claim that I made in that book was I'll call it youthful enthusiasm. It was stronger than the claim I needed to make.
okay, fair. That makes sense. Also, to be fair, you do claim for sure, in the conclusion that it's not only that ontological arguments you can't prove God, but you can't not prove God with ontological art. You can't prove the negation either.
Right. Okay. Sure. So that has to do with the fact that there are lots of ontological arguments that can be. There's a parallel argument that has as its conclusion that God doesn't exist. This is easiest to see with the modal ontological argument. Swap out it's possible that God exists for it's possible that God doesn't exist, and it follows that God doesn't exist, right? So, and this is another one of the reasons for thinking that these arguments aren't any good, right? The fact that you can do that to the modal ontological argument very strongly suggests that we should just put the modal ontological argument aside. And there's a big kind of cottage industry on at the moment, people trying to find reasons to prefer the claim that it's possible that God exists to the claim that it's possible that God doesn't exist. I just think that those attempts to kind of break the symmetry between the two arguments are kind of doomed to fail. That's my opinion. Certainly, what's out there is not very impressive.
I see. So perhaps it makes sense to kind of demarcate between, let's say, religious ontological arguments, and then there's, of course, for instance, a person I can think of as someone like Tim Maudlin, who's a philosopher of physics, and he's trying to understand the ontology of physics. So I'm assuming you wouldn't say that there isn't a place for ontological arguments in other domains, for example, again, like the ontology of physics or perhaps biology.
Right. Right. So ontological argument here is shorthand for ontological argument for the existence of God. So we can certainly argue, we can make arguments for accepting certain things into our ontology, right? There's lots of things that physicists postulate. Whether we should think that there's any ontology that sort of corresponds to those postulates is a kind of open question, right? So you've got a mathematical formalism that you use to make predictions about the world. Which bits of it should you interpret sort of ontologically is kind of can be a very tricky question, and it's a big question in philosophy of quantum mechanics.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. All right, Professor. I think we've got about 15 more minutes, if that's okay to go.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. I'm curious. This is more for for personal reasons because in the past couple of years, I've been really deeply interested in Hegel and reading Hegelians. And in the book, you have a chapter where you do outline kind of the Hegelian, so-called Hegelian arguments. And you even say that you start off the chapter saying, I am not confident that what I have to say in this section is an accurate representation of the thought of Hegel or of any subsequent Hegelians. So, sorry. Again, pertaining to belief in God, what are Hegelian arguments and just what's your critique of them?
So, among other things, Hegel gave several series of lectures on what he called the ontological argument. So back in I guess I'm not too sure about the dates here, but I think in the early 1830s.
Yeah.
And he did this in several years, and we have those lectures. And so when I wrote the book, I sat down and I worked my way through as best I could, those lecture series, trying to work out what he was talking about, what he meant by the ontological argument. And at that point, I just didn't get a satisfactory answer to that question, right? I'm thinking argument has premises and conclusion. I assume the conclusion here is God exists, but what are the premises? And I couldn't reconstruct it from the Hegelian lectures. So it's just a kind of question mark, right? As far as I could see, there wasn't anything that ought to be in the discussion of my book, because my book, I was thinking about arguments as things that have a definite set of premises and a conclusion so that you can assess the validity of the argument and then the truth of the premises. I'm not sure that I've made much more advance on this. I mean, I had a couple of exchanges in journals. So Paul Redding and I think Diego Bubio at Sydney wrote an article in which they claim to set out a Hegelian ontological argument, but they don't do the thing that I wanted to have done. They don't say these are the premises and this is the conclusion. And what they do say at a certain point is, I found quite hard to understand. So I feel like I'm still in the same position that I was in previously, that I don't know exactly what Hegel meant by the ontological argument, but I don't think that it was a set of premises and a conclusion. And so it's not like Anselm's argument or Descartes' argument or Gödel's argument, where we can be quite, well, I mean, in Descartes' case, there's a bunch of different arguments because he wrote about this topic several times. And so there are different things that he says in the Meditations and the Discourse and in the replies to various objectors. There's different things that he says, and it's a bit hard to kind of fit those things together. But at least in the case of Gödel and Anselm, we have a single document. We know what the premises and the conclusion are, right? So,
yeah. Well, yeah. We all know Hegel is notorious for being for almost being impenetrable.
well, it's not that it's impenetrable necessarily. I mean, I know people who are Hegel scholars, and from talking to them, it seems pretty clear that there's an understanding to be had, right? The question is whether Hegel was talking about the kind of thing that I've been talking about in my book, right? So, I mean, other people might have ways of making sense of what he says that don't deliver what I call an argument, and that's fine. If he, right, because that's not what I was trying to do in my book. I wasn't really interested in interpreting anybody. I was interested in collecting arguments and then talking about the arguments, regardless of how the arguments were generated.
Yep, in the
Right.
sense that for you, you wanted to collate arguments which had premises and then a conclusion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I wanted, and
yeah,
then I was going to assess those things.
yeah.
That was my topic. That was my project. Right. Um, so it's not that I mean, you read out the introductory bit of what I said. I didn't think of this as a contribution to the study of Hegel. I didn't think of it as a critique of Hegel. I didn't think of it as anything like that. It was just I thought I need to say that when I read the 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 lectures from on the ontological argument, Hegel's lectures on the ontological argument for a couple of the years in which he gave those lectures, I couldn't find anything that I wanted to call an argument that was the kind of focus of that discussion. Now, in fact, maybe something like that's a bit true of Descartes too. I mean, as I said, Descartes has this syllogism, but it's not clear that he thinks of that syllogism as a successful argument. And then it's not clear what he's trying to do with it when he's talking about it. So recently, there have been a bunch of people who say that Descartes doesn't really have an argument. It's more that there's an intuition that he's trying to pump or something like that. I'm kind of not interested in that discussion. I mean, I'm not that interested in trying to be an interpreter of Descartes. I'm just interested in if there's an argument here, what is it? And then let's talk about the argument.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Now, thank you for humoring me with that, Professor. Okay, the penultimate question. Just curious, I haven't really heard you comment on this topic publicly. What are your thoughts on Christian existentialism with thinkers like Paul Tillich or people like Søren Kierkegaard, just generally as a philosopher of religion? What are your thoughts on that school of thought or that style of thinking, let's say?
So it's interesting that you picked those two because they're both really hard to read. And I find Kierkegaard really, really hard to make sense of. And I find Tillich really hard to make sense of for different reasons. I mean, Kierkegaard's a kind of interesting writer
More like a
and,
poet.
has very interesting rhetorical strategies. Whereas for Tillich, there's a kind of style of writing theology that just the text comes out seeming just quite impenetrable, right? So I haven't read lots of Tillich, and I believe that William Rowe was a student of Tillich's. At any rate, he was a fan of Tillich's early on in his career. But I've never really been tempted to go and probe deeply into his work. Life's too short. There's too many things to
Nah,
do.
that's
And there's
fair.
all these things I would have liked to have read more of that I haven't. Tillich's one of the people that I've just.
Well, I mean, here's where you should become a Christian, and then you'll have eternal life. You can read Tillich.
I won't need to though, surely.
That's for you. You'll always
If I'm one of the elect, I won't need to.
you'll have all
I mean, in
the
fact, I'll be spared it, right? That's maybe if you end up in hell, that's what you have to
that.
continue
Yeah,
to doing.
you gotta spend years reading Kierkegaard and Hegel and Tillich and fantastic. All right, Professor Oppy, last question. Quite a personal one, but I'm curious. As we discussed a bit in this conversation too, people don't come to their beliefs in the sense of we have a set of axioms and then or premises, and we work off them logically and we reason our way through a conclusion. Uh, Rather, most of the time, it's quite the contrary. We have a conclusion, and then we look for premises to or reasons to justify what we already believe, psychologically speaking, of course, and not as a philosopher per se. But what would be one thing that that a belief that you hold strongly, a worldview, a Weltanschauung, to use a German term, let's say, that you're terrified of being wrong about.
I guess I'm much more worried that I'll be right about certain things. So, like lots of people, I look at the current state of the world, especially what we get told by climate scientists, but not only by climate scientists, by a whole lot of other people. And I kind of worry that the future for humanity is going to be quite grim,
Quite
right?
bleak.
It would be nice if I turn out to be wrong about that. But on the other hand, the things that I believe, there's nothing really that I lie awake at night worrying that I might be wrong about it.
That's fair. In fact, in many ways, what you're saying is more bleak because, again, climate science is perhaps case in point. It is, empirically, we have myriad evidence and where the world's going. Well, not to end on a
Yeah,
look.
so I'm sorry, that's a really downer note to end
No,
on,
that's
isn't it?
fine. Sometimes we need a bit of a kick up our ass just to get us going. So that's totally fine. Now, Professor Oppy, it's been an honor. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.